the largest successful heists in history that make Hollywood movies look like amateur hour. When you think about the most audacious crimes ever committed, your mind probably jumps to something you saw in Ocean's 11 or Heat. But the reality is way more insane than anything screenwriters could dream up. We're talking about criminals who walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars, priceless art that can never be replaced, and enough cash to buy small countries. These aren't your typical smash-and-grab robberies. These are meticulously planned operations that took years to execute and left investigators completely stunned for decades. What I'm about to show you are heists so outrageous and so perfectly executed that they've become legendary in the criminal underworld. Some of these cases remain unsolved to this day, with the perpetrators living somewhere out there with their stolen fortunes. Others were solved only because of the most unexpected mistakes you could imagine. But all of them share one thing in common. They were so ambitious and so well planned that they redefined what was possible in the world of organized crime. The craziest part about these heists isn't just the money involved. It's the sheer audacity of the criminals who pulled them off. We're talking about people who walked into the most secure facilities on Earth, convinced guards to let them in, and walked out with enough loot to make them richer than most Fortune 500 CEOs. And in some cases, they did it all while wearing police uniforms or business suits. Now, before we dive into these absolutely insane stories, I need to make something clear. The amounts of money we're talking about here are so astronomical that they'll make your head spin. We're not talking about thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're talking about heists that netted hundreds of millions, and in one case, nearly $1 billion. These numbers are so big that they actually change the way security works at major institutions around the world. Let's start with something that happened right here in the United States and remains one of the most baffling, unsolved crimes in history. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist of 1990 represents the largest property crime in American history, and the story is absolutely wild from start to finish. Picture this. It's March 18th, 1990, and you're working as a security guard at one of Boston's most prestigious art museums. It's around 1 in the morning, and you're doing your usual rounds when someone buzzes the security door. You look at the intercom and see 2 men in police uniforms claiming they're responding to a disturbance call. Now, any reasonable person would let police officers into a museum, right? That's exactly what the guards did, and it was the biggest mistake of their lives. These weren't real police officers. They were thieves dressed up in convincing police costumes, and they had just gained access to one of the most valuable art collections in the world. Within minutes, they had restrained the guards, duct-taped them in the basement, and had complete run of the museum for the next hour and a half. But here's where the story gets even crazier. These weren't art experts who carefully removed priceless paintings. They literally cut the canvases out of their frames with knives, causing irreparable damage to some of the most important artworks in human history. By the time they were done, they had stolen 13 pieces of art worth over $500 million. We're talking about works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Degas, and Manet paintings that had survived for centuries, through wars and revolutions, were destroyed in a single night by criminals who apparently had no idea what they were actually stealing. The thieves took Rembrandt's only known seascape, a Vermeer that was one of only 34 known works by the artist, and multiple Degas pieces that were absolutely irreplaceable. What makes this heist even more mind-blowing is that the security at the museum was shockingly inadequate. The guards were paid barely above minimum wage. The museum had outdated security systems, and there were no motion detectors in the galleries where the most valuable art was displayed. The Gardner Museum's board had consistently refused to upgrade security systems because the museum's founder had left specific instructions that nothing in the museum should ever be changed. The investigation that followed became one of the longest-running art crime investigations in history. The FBI has followed thousands of leads, offered a $10 million reward, and interviewed everyone from Boston mobsters to international art dealers. They've searched the homes of suspected criminals, followed tips from around the world, and even investigated whether the Irish Republican Army was involved. Despite all of this effort, spanning over 30 years, not a single piece of the stolen art has ever been recovered. The empty frames still hang on the walls of the Gardner Museum today, serving as a haunting reminder of what was lost. Museum visitors can walk through the galleries and see exactly where these priceless works once hung, creating an eerie atmosphere that makes the crime feel immediate, even decades later. The investigation is focused heavily on the Boston Mafia, with theories ranging from the theft being commissioned by a private collector to it being carried out as part of a larger organized crime operation. What's particularly frustrating for investigators is that they believe they know who was responsible, but proving it in court has been impossible. The trail leads to several deceased members of organized crime families, But with the main suspects long dead, the case has essentially hit a brick wall. The most promising lead pointed to a notorious gangster named Bobby Donati, who allegedly masterminded the operation, but he was found dead 3 years after the heist under mysterious circumstances. Even more suspicious, several other people connected to the investigation have passed away under questionable circumstances over the years, leading some to believe that whoever ordered the theft has been systematically eliminating anyone who could expose them. But art theft is just one category of these massive heists. When we're talking about pure cash grabs, the numbers get even more ridiculous. Let me tell you about a heist that went down at JFK Airport in 1978 that was so perfectly executed, it inspired one of the greatest crime movies ever made. The Lufthansa heist was the brainchild of some seriously connected criminals who had inside information about a very specific weakness in airport security. These guys knew that Lufthansa kept massive amounts of untraceable cash in a vault at JFK Airport, money that came from currency exchanges and international transactions. We're talking about nearly $6 million in cash and jewelry just sitting there, waiting for someone bold enough to take it. The mastermind behind this operation was a guy who worked directly for the airline and knew exactly when the vault would be most vulnerable. He was drowning in gambling debts and saw this as his only way out. But instead of trying to pull this off alone, he reached out to some very dangerous people who had connections to the Lucchese crime family. These weren't amateur criminals. These were professionals who had been planning and executing major crimes for decades. On December 11, 1978, 6 masked men cut through the airport's perimeter fence like it was made of paper. They knew exactly where the security cameras were positioned, they knew which guards would be on duty, and they knew the precise timing of when the vault doors would be accessible. The entire operation took just over an hour, and by the time airport security realized what had happened, the thieves had vanished with enough money to set them up for life. But here's where this story takes a dark turn that makes it even more incredible than any Hollywood movie. The people who organized this heist were so paranoid about getting caught that they started systematically targeting everyone who had been involved. We're talking about more than a dozen people who either participated in the heist or knew about it who ended up dead or missing over the next few years. Some were shot, others disappeared completely, and one was found frozen solid in the back of a meat truck. The guy who provided the inside information was the only person ever convicted, and he got 15 years in prison. But the masterminds behind the operation were never officially charged, and not a single dollar of the stolen money was ever recovered. The whole thing became the inspiration for the movie Goodfellas, but the real story was actually more intense and more complex than what made it to the screen. The paranoia and violence that followed the Lufthansa heist show you just how high the stakes are when you're dealing with this level of organized crime. These aren't people who are content to just take the money and disappear quietly. They were willing to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to their freedom, including their own partners in the crime. Speaking of crimes that make Hollywood look tame, let me tell you about a heist that happened right here in Los Angeles that netted the criminals nearly $19 million in cash. This wasn't some elaborate scheme involving dozens of people. This was 6 guys who figured out how to rob an armored car depot using nothing but inside knowledge and perfect timing. The Dunbar armored robbery was masterminded by a guy who actually worked for the company he was planning to rob. He spent months studying the security systems, memorizing guard schedules, and figuring out exactly when the facility would be most vulnerable. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a meticulously planned operation that required precise coordination and nerves of steel. These heists represent something far more significant than just really successful crimes. They're proof that with enough planning, inside knowledge, and sheer audacity, even the most secure institutions in the world can be vulnerable. From art museums to armored car depots, from airports to central banks, these criminals found ways to exploit weaknesses that security experts never saw coming. What's truly mind-blowing is that many of these cases remain unsolved decades later, despite massive investigations and enormous reward offers. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum still has empty frames on their walls. The Lufthansa heist money was never recovered, and somewhere out there, the people responsible for these crimes might still be living off their stolen fortunes. The legacy of these heists goes beyond just the money and art that was stolen. They fundamentally changed how security works at major institutions around the world. Museums now have motion detectors, banks have multiple layers of authentication, and armored car companies have completely redesigned their protocols. In a twisted way, these criminals forced the entire security industry to evolve. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about these stories is how they capture our imagination. There's something undeniably compelling about criminals who were so clever and so bold that they managed to pull off the impossible. Even though we know what they did was wrong, we can't help but be impressed by the sheer scale of their ambition and the precision of their execution. The truth is, these heists prove that reality really is stranger than fiction. No screenwriter would dare create characters this audacious or plots this outrageous, because audiences would never believe them. But these crimes actually happened, and they remind us that the most incredible stories aren't always the ones we see in movies.